All right. Tim, welcome to the podcast.
Cool. Thanks for having me, Carl.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. So I wanted to jump in right away and get to know you a little bit, get to know about your company, Red Siege. So you founded this company. Can you talk a little bit about that story? When did you start the company, and what was kind of the premise of starting it?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the security wasn't my sort of original, I don't know, passion necessarily. I mean, I didn't know it was a thing. I watched sneakers like everybody else and thought that was cool, and then it kind of went dormant in the back of my mind for I don't know. That was a long time ago now. However long ago that was. So it started off in control systems of all things. Got into development. Hated that. I liked it, but I don't like trying to chase down the bugs. And then into networking. Love that, but there's nothing more soul sucking than trying to figure out latency issues. Like it's slow. What does that mean, right? And trying to chase that down, and outages of 3 in the morning and crap like that. I'm like, oh, and I was a little bit cowboy. Like, hey, we got a thing. Let's fix it. Like, who needs to change control? Like, let's just take care of this, which was good most of the time, except when it wasn't. Right. So, I mean, the nice thing with being offensive now is we can make changes in production. Right now, of course, don't want to have any sort of negative impact, but it eventually just sort of got into to security. Been pen tested for well over a decade now. I should some point do that math. And I always had this itch, like even when I was sort of young, that I always wanted to sort of start my own company or do something like that. My dad has owned companies. My uncles have done companies. So it's sort of just an entrepreneurial thing that's kind of
In your blood, huh?
in the blood, right? Yeah, yeah. So I'm like, you know what? At some point, I want to do this. So, gosh, we're in our fourth year now. I was like, you know what? I think it's do or die. Like at some point, you just gotta kind of gotta go for it. And it was an interesting experience. I asked John Strand, a dear friend of mine, I'm like, hey, so what do you think about doing this? And his first thing was, well, first off, don't. I know you're not going to listen to me, so let's chat. So he gave me all sorts of great insight there on things to do and things not to do. It's a lot of work, a lot more work than kind of I thought, but at the same time, it's super rewarding. Um, it's sort of like your baby, and you're just kind of cultivating and growing this thing, and um, adding team members and getting some of the cool team dynamics and such that has been tremendously fun, but it's also been hard. Like, small company, you're the person in charge, especially when you're really small. Like the vacation times are not like they were before, where you just
Sure.
disappeared for a week or two, right? Like that's not a thing. Um, so there's a little bit of checking in. It's we're getting big enough now where we can kind of take a little bit of extra step back. I can take a little bit extra step back because I've got some people who can step up and take care of a lot of that responsibility. So that's nice to finally start getting some of that breath, get a breather in there. Um, but
and and for
it's been a fantastic. It's been a fun experience. Yeah, go ahead.
for folks that don't already know, can you tell us a little bit about what Red Siege does?
Sure. Yeah. So, company I founded was Red Siege. We do all kinds of offensive things. So we do pen testing. That means network pen testing, internals, externals, um, web pen testing, mobile, red teams, assumed breach, and some purple in there. So kind of all the offensive ish or things really closely related to offensive security. So we, the term I always people ask, like, what do you do? Like, I'm a penetration tester, and then they giggle, and you're like, no, that's not a crappy pickup line, right? Like, I've heard all the jokes, so you can skip all those, right? But it's we do all the hacking, and it's a lot of fun. The technical challenges are a lot of fun, and then now more recently the business side is a tremendously enjoyable experience.
So what made you take that leap of, it sounded like you were doing pen testing for another company for a while, and then you're like, you know what, I'm gonna do this. Like, what made you kind of go all in and say, I'm gonna do this?
Yeah, I mean, I also teach for SANS, so the nice thing, like, it wasn't just a jump off the
Sure.
cliff and hope, right? Because I've got this really nice safety net of teaching for SANS. So even if like no clients come in, we're not going to be bad off. So that was something that I really needed to make that. I can't even call it a leap because it was like maybe like a slightly larger step because I'm not going as far in and the risk is significantly lower. But it was just something that I've always wanted to do, and it's been something just nagging me. Say, look, at some point, you got to do this. And I looked at my age, where we were in the industry, the family. I'm like, look, it's literally now, or it's going to be too late to take that, not leap, but
That big
I
step.
mean, it is a big step, right? Yeah, I mean, because it's a whole different thing. There's no one in charge. There's especially when you start off by yourself and you're solo. There's no one to say, hey, should we do this differently? Because it's just you. So you've got to kind of learn things on your own, figure some of those things out, find other smart people who are doing the same sorts of things, and talk to other people. I think where we've been successful so far, almost in spite of me, because I have a lot of smart friends who I can ask and learn from, and hopefully learn from their mistakes, learn from maybe from their missteps. And that's so much more important. That's not just business. That's just frankly life.
Yeah.
Right? But it was just one of those things I always wanted to do. And at the beginning, it was more difficult than I thought because now everything is from scratch, right? Like you write a report, there is no template.
Yeah.
You write the template. Hey, you got a finding? Cool. Every single finding is a completely new finding. Like you don't have any of the basic, like, hey, out of date software. There's no copying and pasting from anything else. That is solely on you. So that spool up the contracting. Like, what does the contracting process look like? What do those documents look like? Right? Like I wasn't fully aware of necessarily some of all. I knew the process, but I didn't have some of the paperwork. So we had attorneys to talk to, friends to talk to get things like the master service agreements and statements of work and get those all fleshed out. And then, every once in a while, things go a little bit sideways. We're like, okay, time to update the contracts so that this doesn't happen again. So there's a whole learning process, and things are starting to get a little bit smoother now that we've knocked off a bunch of those rough edges with not quite missteps, but maybe near misses and things like that. And now we've got some of those processes in place and templates that we've got, some basic processes in place. If I come across old software, I've got a template for that specific finding. It's not write this whole bloody thing from scratch. So the reporting's a little bit easier. Still plenty of work there, and still nobody loves reporting, but a lot easier, of course.
Gotta do it. Gotta do it. So when you called your friend and you said, "Hey, I'm going to start this company," and you said,
Yeah.
"Don't do it, but here's some advice."
Yeah.
Did he give you? What were some of the takeaways? Was his advice good? Like now, 4 years later, you're doing it. Like, did you take some pieces from him that were like, "Oh yeah, he was totally right on this," or maybe he wasn't right on these things, or maybe it was completely different experience than the advice he gave you?
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot. I mean, honestly, I kind of forgot what he said because it was a little bit of a blur. So I used to go back all the time, like, hey, what's this? What do you think about this? One of the biggest, this one was kind of a leap, was hiring the first person, because now you go from, hey, it's just me, right? And if I sink this ship, I'm the only one on it, and I can figure out a way out, right? But now I've got Mike was the first person on our team. Mike's now on the team. If this ship sinks, it's not just my family that goes down. I'm now taking somebody else down with me, and we keep adding more and more people. You're like, man, this boat's getting pretty heavy, right? And sort of that process of bringing people on board. The most miserable experience is, I mean, given that we're a virtual company, is dealing with all of the different states. So like North Dakota has three, or is it North Carolina? One of the two. I forget if it's Corey's, and I think it's Corey's state. Yeah, North Carolina has like 3 different IDs that you have to use in these different systems. And then like North Dakota, you have to get workman's comp through the state of North Dakota, not from someplace else. But there's all these other little tiny things are like, oh my gosh, this just is soul sucking. And it doesn't help the business in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
So
how many different states are you in?
Man, Texas, Florida, North Carolina, North Dakota, Virginia. I think that's it.
Huh. And then you got to go and research like, okay, what are the things I have to do in order to do business in the state? And that seems like a lot of a lot of time sucks. I know, I mean, I had a startup and I went through all that stuff too of like, okay, what filings do I got to do? Like what things, like how do you set this thing up? And you know, we were able to find there was a thing called Clerky that kind of helped us with like, you know, setting up because we did a C Corp. We you know, went a little bit because like the idea was that, you know, in order to like, we were going to want to raise money at some point. So in order to raise money, a lot of investors want to see a C Corp. And we're like, oh, this is really complicated. You need a lawyer and all this. And we were lucky enough to find this Clerky thing that was like, you know, basically made it really easy to incorporate in Delaware, which is where all the startups incorporate because it's the easiest place to do it. So, but yeah, it's there's all these little things like that. And, you know, I was talking to a friend of mine who has a business with, he sells birds, like all different kinds of birds. And he was telling me about, you can have a black swan or you can have a white swan. You can't have a white swan, you know, but you can have a black swan, but not a white one, you know, like just like all these like weird rules in different states and all these types of things. And yeah, those are really difficult things to navigate. They should make it a lot easier.
Well, because that was a thing that I'm like, I think that is the single most surprising thing was the difficulty working across different states. Because I mean, Texas was relatively easy. We don't have a personal state income tax, so there was no, I didn't have to set that up, right? Not plenty of other states do, which that one wasn't necessarily hard. But then there's unemployment insurance and workman's comp, and I thought workman's comp, people will work from home, I don't need workman's comp. Well, that worked well until they got fined by the state of North Dakota for not having workman's comp because Mike works from home. And I mean, we eventually, and frankly, just relatively recently switched to a PEO, where technically we're all employees of this sort of intermediary that's owned by us and another company. Long story short is they just handle all the payroll stuff because it's an onboarding, and it just makes my life, I mean, you pay for it, but realistically it saves money because of the time and then healthcare.
And then you can focus on what you do best. You know, you don't have to worry about that stuff. So
that was one of the best pieces of advice that I got from John and from other people. He's like, look, delegate the stuff that you're not good at. Don't try to save $10 by trying to do something that you absolutely hate, right? Or whatever the number is. And I'm like, look, managing all these various states and paying all this, it's a pain in the butt. It doesn't help make the company better. It doesn't help with growth. It's a speed bump. Let somebody else take care of that. So, you know, we pay a little extra to have that PEO take care of it, but it's made my life a lot less stressful, and I can focus a lot more on the business, focus a lot more on the technical side as well.
So if there's pen testers out there and they're listening to this and they've been thinking about, you know, like maybe I want to start a company, you know, and they're kind of, you know, but they're comfortable in the position that they're at the company they're working for. You know, what kind of advice would you give to them and to help them make the decision on whether or not they'd want to, you know, start their company? Is there any kind of advice you'd have to anyone like that?
Yeah, I mean, the being sort of the traditional employee is nice, right? I mean, you're technically you're beholden to the company, but at the same time, you get vacation time, you get days off, right? In some respects, that ease also means that it's, well, the responsibility shift is there a little bit. So now, like if I, especially back in the olden days, if I took vacation, there's no paycheck coming in, right? Whereas if you got a day job, you take some vacation, like the check still comes in. You take that time off and it's not there. You don't take care of all the little pieces. There's no one to necessarily kind of fall back on, right? Like I have plenty of friends who started their own business and then got behind on invoicing. I don't think it's fun, but that's literally the piece that brings in the money.
Right.
So now, like, I will jump on that as quick as possible. I don't enjoy it, but take that spoonful of medicine because that's how I pay myself and frankly everybody else, right? The big thing is before you take that leap, make sure you've got clients or have a way to get some of the clients, right? Because I've known some other people who are like, "Yeah, let's try this thing," like, and they're like, "How do you find clients?" I'm like, "Well, you needed to have some of that up front, right? Like that's not just this thing where you just like, hey, let's go on the internet and Google clients and they show up."
Oh, it'd be great
That
if
was
it was that
another
easy.
nice.
Yeah.
What's that?
It'd be great if it was that easy.
Oh my gosh, right? It's not
Get
as
me
simple
some
as just
clients.
Google AdWords. Yeah. Again, I was fortunate enough to be in a place in teaching with Sands. There's a little bit of name recognition out there that helps. I had friends, and I did some We did some subcontracting work. This year, I think we've done very, very little, but that's definitely sort of a transition. As you oftentimes start off doing a lot of subcontracting work and then rolling into your own thing. But the subcontracting work, I mean, if you're the prime, if their business goes down, guess what? Who's the first person to go? And it's going to be the subcontractors, right? I mean, that's the whole purpose of having subcontractors is so that they can burst. So, keep an eye on the economy, make sure you're not stepping into it. I wouldn't suggest maybe starting it here quite yet. We're at the end of 2020 at this point, 2021. Could be a little bit of a downturn, but make sure some other advice I got both from John, from Ed Scotus, Kevin Johnson, and then other people who own their own companies is keep some money in the bank where if the company goes sideways for a couple of months, you can still pay yourself, pay everybody else. So we sit on, it fluctuates depending on the time of year, 3 to 6 months of cash, so that it literally, if nothing comes in for the next few months, we still pay the bills. And it helps you keep sane. The stress levels are, sort of gone. Like, hey, slow month, cool. Let's hunker down, and I can still sleep and I can still be refreshed, right?
Sure.
Even when it is a little bit slower. A lot of people don't like that because it's weird to look over and be like, that's a large sum of money in that bank account, right? But at the same time, like, look, this is for the company that if things go sideways, everybody's still getting paychecks, and it just is what it is. It's there, and yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that advice. I think that's some really good things to think about if you are thinking about making that leap. Like, you want to make sure that you do it right. Think it through and understand what the undertaking is. And then I just kind of wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about what are the things that you've been seeing over the last few years, and like how has your pen testing strategies evolved over the last couple of years? What are some of the things that you've done differently, and what are some of the kind of the new strategies that you guys are employing?
Yeah, I mean, so a number of years ago, 5-6 years ago, the traditional sort of pen test was super common. So we start with some sort of internal access, if it's an internal pen test, and we go from there. Then there was kind of a shift, at least in my experience. Maybe someone else more has a different experience, but in my experience, there was a big shift then to the red team, right? So you have to fight to get that initial access, which is nice because it more realistically represents what's happening in the real world. I'll transition there, but I'm sort of seeing a transition from that more into the assumed breach. The red team is a lot of fun, but there's a lot of waiting. So you have to craft a payload, and then convince somebody to click it, right? You send this email and you're like, well, is this person on vacation? Did it get caught by a spam filter? Did they click it but not getting the connection back, right? What exactly is going on? And there's a lot of sort of in that time just waiting. And even if it goes relatively quickly, it still can take a lot of time to develop those payloads, to get the evasions, to get whatever it may be. So in my more recent experience, in fact, I sort of steer people away from red teams to some extent, more to the assumed breach. We're like, look, let's just assume this thing hits. Right? At some point, someone's going to click on it. At some point, some bad guy, malicious actor out there is going to develop a payload, and it's going to hit. Let's start from there, right? Because in the real world, that's what we're seeing. We're seeing phishing is the predominant way in. We're seeing
right.
trusted insider as well, right?
Hmm.
Which realistically is sort of the same for the assumed breach, right? We're starting with the access as a user, whether it be phished, whether it be a malicious user. Let's start from that point and then continue. And we can save some of the time and therefore money of the phishing piece up front and the payload development to some degree. And I find it to be a little bit more efficient, and we could be a lot quicker and more efficient, and we can find a lot of the same sorts of things. So we start with that access. And I think one of the other big things that we've seen over the years too is it used to be that the cool thing to do was to go for the extreme privilege. Like, hey, I want in, I want to get domain admin. I want to be the king of the entire network. And it's sort of a, I don't want to say maturity, but it's sort of a maturity in the pen test life cycle as you become a pen tester and move through it. You're like, you know what, that domain admin is useful, but it's more of a cool trick at the end because you can do a lot of the same sort of thing without necessarily having to get that extreme permission, those rights throughout the entire organization. You might land on, for example, an engineering person's computer, and that person has access to the intellectual property, those drawings. Well, as an attacker, the attacker no longer needs to move. They can just simply look. And we see time and time again that these file shares or whatever it might be have overly shared files where anybody inside the organization, right? Steve in accounting or Sally in marketing could just go to file share and be like, cool, let's grab a bunch of this stuff. And now you have a breach, right? Now you're in the news. Have you lost everything? Absolutely not. Have you lost enough to be in the news? Yeah, maybe, right? Or have some sort of negative impact or fines or something like that. So I think those are some of the other benefits to that sort of assumed breach model.
So when you do the assumed breach, are you still doing some of the red teaming stuff as well? Or is it just, you start out with kind of working backwards from there's a breach, what do we do now type thing, or is it both?
So we've had clients do both. So we've had some where, hey, let's start the assumed breach, but we want to be, quote, very red, meaning we want you to go very low and slow. So we'll seed access to this particular system. We want to see, can our defenders detect as you move or as you exfiltrate, or lateral movement, attempt to log in, whatever it might be. Those, of course, are going to take a little bit longer because we want to be much more specific. I can't think of the right word. Much choosier on the exact commands we use and when we do them and how quickly we do them. Whereas others will do them fast, kind of like the pen test. We're like, look, let's rip through this to be as efficient as possible in an attempt to find a lot of these high risk findings, and deliver the report that shows the business risk. I think that one of the other big benefits with the assumed breach versus the internal pen test is traditional internal pen test. We set up on the network and we start scanning the network. At no point is the attacker going to be on the network running scanners across the network. It's too loud, right? And oftentimes, as we talked about, phishing or that trusted insider, they essentially start with access. So we're spending times a little bit misguided, at least in my opinion, with the sort of traditional test.
Gotcha. And has there been anything new as far as attackers, like any ways in? I mean, you mentioned phishing, and I think phishing has always been like the number one way to get in is, you know, tricking a user into clicking something and then now they're in, right? Is there anything else that's like that's happened since, I don't know, since COVID, or anything that's newer out there that you've noticed over the last couple of years?
Sure, the COVID has changed things dramatically because of the work from home.
Hmm.
Many people were in the office, and now they moved to home, which means remote access. And a lot of some organizations had no remote access, or a minimal remote access, or if they had it, it didn't scale to the degree that people needed. So, you know, the access mechanisms weren't there, the monitoring wasn't there for these systems, and we've seen people just like, hey, we've got this Windows server, let's just set up remote desktop on the internet. And we're seeing a lot of bad guys just get jumping on these Windows systems with remote desktop RDP, logging in, you know, try a couple of credentials, get in, and then game over. VPN, a lot more VPN users, right? The average person inside maybe a company, let's say a receptionist or something, they don't need VPN access, right? And plenty of other people who didn't need VPN access. Now, literally everybody does. So there's a lot more exposure there. Maybe some of those systems like, hey, let's move this to the cloud, move it online, and we don't have the security set and configured correctly, and there's additional exposure there. So we're seeing a lot of that, and we saw, of course, a lot of the phishing emails around COVID. Now that I have a personal opinion, like, yeah, you know, the attackers are doing that, but if I'm doing a phishing exercise, there's a ethical and moral boundary where I'm like, you know what, using that for our phishing exercise doesn't seem right? Where, in my personal opinion, do no harm. And if I'm causing someone to not take the proper safety precautions, even though it's for the good of the test, it doesn't sit well with me.
Sure. Yeah, that's really interesting. People just spinning up the remote desktops and on the internet, and I guess so. Yeah, I guess there is a lot more exposure with more people connecting from home. Is there easy things that companies can do to mitigate this, or I mean, it kind of seems like you have to make sure you have a good plan in place to make sure that you're thinking about all these security issues that, you know, could potentially happen, right?
Yeah, and that's the problem is, given time, people probably could have planned better, but it was literally like, you know, a Thursday or whatever it was, and you're like, boom, tomorrow we go online, right? And so there was no time to plan. So it was, get this thing in, and then we'll plan afterwards. And they try to shoehorn this stuff, and then once it's up, now trying to switch it to the right way is more difficult. And then another piece associated with that too, if I'm all of a sudden setting up additional VPN for people, maybe initially everyone had two-factor. Well, now I've got a whole bunch of people who didn't have VPN. Maybe I don't have tokens for them. They don't know how to use them. They don't have it. So we've got, you know, maybe I'd step back in security as we start to distribute some of those extra tokens to people. So it was a interesting change. It was kind of beautiful though to see some of the adaptation by people to get ready. But at the same time, I mean, it's brutal, right? People are still getting their sea legs in this whole thing, trying to still get, you know, remote and cloud and whatever it might be set up to service their users and their customers.
Yeah, no, it's been really interesting. I know my wife was telling me like she's like, it would have taken our company like 4 years to figure out how to do remote stuff, but we had to figure out how to do it in a week, you know, like, so people had to adapt quickly, and they had to, and as a result, sometimes there are those missteps, and you can't think of everything, right? So it's, you know, you do what you can with what you got, and but, you know, now that we kind of ripped the Band-Aid off, now it's the time to make sure you go back and, you know, dot your I's and cross your T's and all that, right?
Well, it's some of the other interesting pieces there too. Like I saw a bunch of stuff. I think a little bit less so these days, but I had companies asking me like, well, how do you keep an eye on your employees to make sure they're getting their work done? And they wanted essentially spyware on the systems to make sure, like some I heard about would like look at the webcam or the camera on the laptop and see if somebody's sitting behind the desk. And there's much deeper issues than the security issues, right? And sort of my model, I mean, we've been virtual since the company started, and I've been remote for a decade now. And it's a different management style, it's a different work style, and you have to look, is there output? If there's no output, they're not doing their work.
Right. Exactly.
Other people are like, is your butt in the desk?
Right.
I don't care if your butt's in the desk. If you're getting your job done in a timely fashion, I don't care if you have your butt in the desk, right? And when people sort of move to that model, it's a little bit different. Like, I got one of my guys who loves to go hunting and fishing and go for walks, and he'll, middle of the day, pop smoke, but then he'll work in the evening or whatever, just because that's what he loves to do. Another guy who likes to travel, maybe in the after times, he'll pop into, random country and do some work from there, because it doesn't matter. Like, just get the work done. But we see a lot of those sort of old ideas of, I could stick my head out of my office and gaze upon the people in the cube farm, and if they're there, they're working, or they're not. But then, of course, the people side too, at least for me, I remember when I switched to work from home, I had a horrible time. The first 3 months was miserable. I didn't know how to split work from life. I was always, I'd be at my desk and be like, hey, I can finish this later because I work from home, and I'd be on Google. And then later, like, I would take my laptop to the living room because I'm like, hey, I'm watching this, but I need to get some work done. I was like working all the time, but getting less done. And it was miserable until I learned to set some of those boundaries and adapt there. Right. So it's been interesting. That's for sure.
Yeah, it definitely has been an interesting time, and we've all had to deal with it and adapt, and yeah, so we'll see what happens and how much of this will carry over till after there's a vaccine, and how much remote stuff will probably. I mean, a lot of people, I think, are finding that some of it's working, and so I think a lot of it will stick around, but it'll be interesting to see how this kind of changes our work styles and all that kind of stuff.
Well, I'm wondering that too, because I think that's going to be fascinating to see. Like, I wish I would have thought about it months ago and invested in, like, I don't know what you call them, but remote workplace, right? Like the place where a bunch of people can come. Like, you grab your laptop, you show up at this place. They got like a cube and desks and chairs and coffee place, and you could work there and simulate the office. Because I think, as you said, you're going to see a lot more of that. We're seeing sort of this migration from expensive areas of the country to quite literally anywhere else.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's going to be an interesting transition. I'm kind of curious how that kind of plays out long term. I mean, I expected that to happen at some point, but this is definitely a fast forward button. Like, hey, we're making this change now, and I don't know if we ever go back.
Right. Yeah. It's definitely accelerated the way that we've I think I heard, like, I thought this was an interesting thing that and it was, I think, the CEO of Airbnb, he was talking about how he thinks in the future people will spend their work on their screens, but do their leisure time away from screens and doing more travel and stuff, because everyone just like works on a computer all day, and there'll be less people less watching TV and Netflix and stuff, and more getting out and doing stuff. It's kind of flipped. So you go to leisure and you come home to work, kind of thing. And I was like, that's an interesting flip flop of the way that we do things. You get home from work and you turn on the TV versus, like, I've been looking at a TV all day, I need to get away.
Yeah.
So
I thought about that aspect. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, one of the things, like, for me, was switching to the remote is, after I finally developed some boundaries, like, we could go on. This was still, well, actually, that was a long time ago. But, like, even starting the company, it takes a lot of work to get this thing going, but we could go places, and everyone's in bed, like, hey, let me crank out this report real quick, and then let's go to the beach during the day. And then everyone's taking a nap in the afternoon. Let me get through a couple of these things. So I mean, I wasn't working full time, but I was still able to get some of those sort of things done. Other times, like we've gone to travel to go see family, and I didn't take. This was before when I had the quote normal day job and not my own thing. Like I would just work during the day because the kids would play outside, and my brother or dad or whoever was out working, and we'd hang out in the evening. So it gave me more flexibility to I don't know, see and travel and do things, but not necessarily take vacation, if you will. Right. I mean, there's an extreme danger there where you can cross that line and never take vacation. Don't do that. I've been there. But it does give you exactly like that. Like Jason on my team, he'll go to Thailand and box and then get his work done at night. So yeah.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens. So Tim, this has been a lot of fun. Do you have any parting words for our listeners? Any plugs you want to make? Any anything where people can find you if they want to stay connected with you? Anything for the listeners?
Yeah. So I guess if you want to reach out, hit me up if you've got questions hit me up on Twitter, Tim Medin, that's MEDIN. So TIM Mike Echo Delta India November. No one can spell my name, so that's okay. It looks like timed in with two M's kind of.
Timed in. I love it.
Yeah. Or if you want to drop me an email, tim@redsiege.com. Keep that easy because you can't spell my last name right. So just tim@redsiege.com. Don't worry about spelling Red Siege. I got the I before E and E before I. So yeah, feel free to hit me up those places. And if you're at a conference, maybe at some point, stop over, say hi.
Cool. Yeah, it'll be great to meet you in person. Maybe at CypherCon one of these days. One of these days when we're back in person doing it. So.
Yeah, I grew up in central Wisconsin. So Mike, one of the guys, a mutual friend of ours. The listeners know Mike?
Yeah.
I don't know. Okay.
It's a CypherCon podcast. So
So we went to a football game. It feels like ages ago. A Packers game 2 years ago now, maybe. I forget what it was. Anyway, yeah. So I miss being back in Wisconsin, even in the winters. I like the snow. I miss skating, skiing, curling, stuff like that.
Where are you now?
I am east of Dallas by 2 hours.
Okay. Okay.
I say small town. It's 600. It's 100,000 people, but in Texas, that's a bump in the road, right? Like that's 100,000 and whatever.
Yeah, lots of people in Texas.
Yep.
Cool. Well, yeah, thank you for taking the time, Tim. And yeah, hopefully I get to meet you at one of these cons in person. And until then, take care.
Yeah, I look forward to it. Thanks again. Thanks for having me, Kyle.
All right.